Uh, Good morning, folks. This is Instructor Gaynor. I guess it's not good morning, but anyway, I'm here to talk about your chapter concerning evaluating extended arguments. I really just wanted to introduce what this chapter pertains to and the kinds of activities that you should be able to master in the process. Now, I like to describe this chapter as a sort of tying it all together chapter. Because what we're doing is, instead of looking at smaller extracts and arguments like we were in prior chapters and evaluating them for informal fallacies and deceptive language and so forth, we're going to be looking at longer editorial length types of arguments and analyzing those. We will actually be pulling all of the skills that we've learned throughout this course out of your kit bag and applying them here. So in a sense, this might be seen as a sort of culminating activity, bringing all of your skills together. Now, the first step that you ought to be doing when you're evaluating your extended argument is give the essay a thorough reading. Now, feel free to take as many notes as you want. Some of the things you might like to make note of are if you can identify what the main thesis is. That is, what is the arguer trying to argue? Consider the pieces of the essay as well as how they might relate back to supporting the alleged thesis. It also doesn't hurt to note any other observations. Are there any glaring fallacies? Are there any glaring word or phrase choices that might be there to influence the reader psychologically rather than rationally? If there are any statistics there, you might want to note those to go back and evaluate those later on. Now, for the second, more formal process, identify the thesis and constructing an outline. Now, folks, the first thing you should do, because this will kind of guide the entire process, is do your best to identify what the thesis is and keep it in mind while you're doing your evaluation. Now, you've likely heard this in other courses where you've dealt with argumentation or evaluating writing. But the likely places to find a thesis, if the essay is well written, that's an important caveat, is near the end of the first paragraph, because the thesis is supposed to guide you through the reading. You should also find the thesis reiterated near the end. Now, keep in mind, not everyone writes in this way. Some essays you might read might be slipshod, admittedly, simply because an essay is published somewhere doesn't mean it's well constructed or well put together. In some cases, you may have to work a little harder to find the thesis. And in other cases, the thesis might simply be unstated but implied, particularly if someone is arguing by allegory or something of that sort. Anyway, the next step is that you might want to consider how the various pieces of the essay may relate to supporting the thesis or some other sub-thesis. Now, if you're finding that a whole bunch of the essay doesn't seem to relate back to the thesis, you may want to reconsider whether or not you actually identified the thesis properly. Now, this is just a reiteration of part of what I've already mentioned. Keep in mind that every part of the essay, in one way or another, ought to be relevant to supporting either the main thesis or some sub-thesis supporting the larger thesis. Next, looking for problems. This is the part of the analysis you're going to be pulling in all of the tools that you've learned so far in this course. Examine for logical fallacies. Are any of the informal fallacies that we've learned about in the course present in this essay? If they are glaring fallacies, if the main argument hinges upon this particular argument that happens to be fallacious, that might be a good reason for assessing the argument, the entire argument, as problematic. However, if it's just a small piece of the argument, there might be more to it that the argument may otherwise be well supported. So don't be ready to reject an argument out of hand simply because you find one or two perhaps minor errors. Deceptive psychological ploys might be at play. Has the author used any commonplace assumptions that people might make uncritically? Are there stereotypes about the opponent made here? Is the author playing fast and loose with what the opponent thinks? Is the author playing on what he or she takes to be his or her audience's biases? If so, you should also keep in mind your own biases, but I'll talk about that more shortly. Finally, we've recently discussed language and how persuasive language can be at steering somebody into thinking things that they may not otherwise think if the language were more neutral. Do any of these devices or fallacies undermine the overall credibility of the argument? Now, preparing a larger assessment. Now, I'm not a stickler for this, but I do expect that a critical reader should be able to write a short outline of the argument or some kind of narrative synopsis. In this, you should be able to demonstrate that you understand what the main thesis is, and if there are any sub-theses, keep those in mind too. Be able to show how the various pieces of the essay fit into supporting the overall thesis. In your assessment, you should also be able to point out some major fallacies, psychological ploys, or rhetorical devices. Be able to explain how or why they took place, as well as whether or not you think that their presence severely compromises the credibility of the argument. This goes without saying, but you should always be prepared to check your own biases. Have your own biases unduly influence your assessment of this argument as reasonable or unreasonable. Keep in mind that simply because you might like a particular conclusion, that it does not mean that the argument provided is in fact a cogent argument. We also have to beware that simply because we like a particular conclusion, we might end up giving an arguer a free pass simply because we agree with them. That's what a critical thinker should try to avoid doing. Now, finally, note that often what is left out of an argument is often as essential as what is included in an argument. This might remind you of a fallacy discussed earlier in the course. We talked about something called suppressed evidence. In some cases, an arguer might clearly know that there is some information out there that might undermine her thesis. So, what might she do? She may conveniently leave that out of the argument, hoping that readers either don't know about that or might ignore it or might not think about it. Writers also frequently cherry pick information that would seem to support a thesis while conveniently leaving out any information that might contradict it. Beware of your own tendency to engage in confirmation bias too. Now, these are some other things to consider that I've mostly already stated. I'm just reiterating. Are the reason or reasons provided relevant to supporting the thesis? If there's a whole lot of irrelevant information in an essay, that might count against the larger argument's credibility. Are the sources provided likely reliable sources, or are they highly partisan and likely to be suspect? Now, frequently, strong partisans will take information from like-minded sources. Now, simply because they're like-minded sources doesn't mean that they're automatically problematic. However, strong partisans are already likely to psychologically hold particular points of view. They are likely to look for information that confirms the viewpoints that they already hold, and they are likely to conveniently overlook or ignore any kind of contrary information or positions. Now, keep in mind, don't reject something partisan out of hand simply because it's partisan. You might be committing some form of ad hominem fallacy if you do so. However, it is just good prudence to be wary of overly partisan sources, as they're often likely to play fast and loose with the facts and to also misrepresent any kind of opposing arguments. You might recall that's the concept of setting up a straw man of the opposition. Now, if there are statistical appeals within the argument, you might like to consider that A, are the statistics being provided likely trustworthy? And if so, are the statistics relevant to the case at hand in the way that the author alleges that they are? And finally, do the statistics imply what the author actually contends that they do? Beware of thinking that simply because numbers are apparently objective, and you've all heard the phrase that the numbers don't lie, you can't forget this other truism. People using numbers oftentimes lie. So do be wary of statistics. They oftentimes look extremely trustworthy, extremely reliable. However, people oftentimes use them for deceptive purposes. Now, finally, can you think of any independent reasons supporting or challenging the thesis that the author may not have included? You shouldn't just be doing an assignment like this to try to reject an argument. I like to talk about what philosophers sometimes call applying the principle of charity. We shouldn't just be out there trying to dismantle everybody's argument, especially arguments that we don't happen to like the conclusions of. We should actually be looking at the argument with as little bias as possible and seeing if the reasoning is strong or not. And if indeed the author may have unintentionally left out reasons that might actually support the thesis, those are things to keep in mind. Because indeed, if a thesis can be supportable by outside reasons, we should probably consider those too before we reject the thesis. We should also be looking for if the author has left anything out that might challenge the thesis, that may have been intentionally suppressed. Now, finally, bringing it all together. And this is just a reiteration of what you ought to be doing. Find the thesis, keep it in mind. Can you summarize or outline the argument? When you're evaluating the supporting reasons that the author is providing, are those reasons likely reliable, relevant, and are they conclusive? In other words, has the author put together enough information that makes the argument plausible? Also, as a critical reader, can you briefly summarize why you mostly find the argument to be cogent or why you're likely to reject it as mostly fallacious? Finally, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to ask. If an assignment like this is new to you, you might have concerns about even how to get started. If you're unfamiliar with a topic, you might have some questions related to the topic that you might want to ask about. I'm here, you know how to reach me. Now, note that having some background knowledge on a topic can certainly be helpful. However, One should also be wary of your own biases and always be prepared to reevaluate your perspective if new, reliable, and relevant conflicting information arises. A thesis that strongly goes against your own entrenched worldview is indeed one that you'll probably psychologically be ready to reject out of hand. But that's really not what a good critical thinker does. A good critical thinker is prepared to reassess his or her own positions if good information comes along that leads her to doing so. Cheers, and don't hesitate to ask me questions if you have them.